Hi, this is Jake Vile with a quick video about some of the highlights from Chapter 1 of our reading in Environmental Economics. So there are two key concepts I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about trade-offs, and then second, we'll talk about incentives. So first of all, trade-offs. What is that? A trade-off is whenever you're giving up one thing to be able to do another thing. So an example could be, I give up an hour of my time that I would like to be spending with my family at leisure to go work for an hour. Now if I work, I get money. So there's this trade-off, right? Either I spend time with my family or I go make extra money. So we see trade-offs all of the time. Basically, whenever people are making choices, there's trade-offs involved, right? You're giving up one thing to be able to do another thing. That's the essence of a trade-off. We see them all the time in the world. We think about them all the time in economics. It's an important way to kind of formalize decision making, to think about the trade-offs people are making. So you'll hear that term a lot. You'll notice in the week 1 homework I actually ask you to look at a news article that talks about an environmental issue and then think about what trade-off is involved, because there's always some form of trade-off. We're always giving up something in order to get something else. And sometimes it's an active decision, sometimes it's a passive decision. But whenever we're looking at some kind of issue in environmental realm, there's always some sort of trade-off. And so that's one way that economists start to frame an issue, to be able to start thinking about it in an analytical way. So for example, with climate change, one of the big environmental issues, there's a trade-off between having lots of economic activity that requires the use of a lot of fossil fuels and has a lot of carbon emissions versus not emitting as much carbon and not affecting the environment as much. So economic activity, higher quality atmosphere. That's a big trade-off that we face in the climate realm. You see it all the way down to very local issues. So when I decide that I want to compost, instead of throwing food waste into my garbage, I would like to compost it and then I can use it for my garden as a fertilizer next year. Well, there are trade-offs involved in that, right? I need to have a separate container to put the compost in. I need to spend time figuring out where and perhaps spending money on getting a compost bin to be able to put that compost in, and then I have to turn it. So there's money and there's time involved, but I end up getting compost that I can use as fertilizer at the end of the year. And the whole time I'm doing it, I feel good because I'm putting less stuff in the trash stream, right? So those are some of the trade-offs involved in a simple activity like composting some of your food waste. There's time, there's money, there's reducing garbage and the feelings I get from that, and there's fertilizer for my garden. That's my dog Teddy. He still has a cone, but by next week he'll have the cone off, so he'll be feeling better by then. We'll all be happy by that. So related to trade-offs is the idea of incentives. So incentives are things that spur people to act in a certain way. So we have incentives all the time around us, just like there are trade-offs, and they're closely related. Very often, trade-offs involve incentives on one side or both sides, right? So where do we see incentives? Well, my work offers to pay me money to show up. So that's an incentive, right? Money is a very common incentive that people use to try to change behavior. So we give bonuses to employees who do well, who are very productive. We give rewards to people who do things that we like. You return something that was lost, that you didn't have to return, but you do it. We give a reward. That's an incentive. You want to come say hi, Teddy? Come here. Oh, we'll give you a good look at Teddy. He's about 6 months old. He's a sweet guy. And he has the cone for 2 more days. So we're counting down. You want to say hi, Teddy? All right. So I'm going to give you incentives, if you're a dog lover, to watch the videos, because you'll get to see Teddy, right? Incentives. So in the homework this week, I also asked you to think about what incentives are being used or might be used in an environmental issue. So economists think of incentives often in terms of economic incentives. Even traditional environmental regulation, which we call command and control regulation, it involves incentives. What happens there is, traditionally in environmental regulation, the government would say, you can't do a certain thing. You can't pollute into this stream. What would happen if you did pollute into that stream? Well, the government would come in and perhaps arrest you, threaten you with jail, perhaps confiscate your property or your company, perhaps give you a big fine. So all of those things are incentives, right? So we use the law to create all of these incentives. We want people to stop polluting, so we create a law that says don't pollute. The law also says if you do continue polluting after you've been warned, these are the things that can happen to you. So those are actually incentives. But when we talk about incentives in a class like this, what we're really talking about are economic incentives. So if instead of threatening people with jail if they pollute, we say for every pound of effluent that comes out of your pipe and goes into that stream, you're going to have to pay us $2. That would be an economic incentive. It's kind of like a fine, but it takes away kind of the moral aspect of it, right? Instead, it's just putting a price on this that is trying to get people to do something that we want them to do. So another example of an economic incentive is when we have some kind of cap and trade program. So we give people permits that say, you're allowed to emit this much pollution. And then we let people buy and sell those. Well, what happens on the market then is that people who can cut down their pollution really cheaply end up doing that and selling their permits because they can get more money by selling the permits than it costs them to reduce their pollution. So both something like an effluent tax or a cap and trade program, those would be examples of economic incentives. And those are often what economists turn to as opposed to command and control regulation, where we're threatening people with jail or big fines. We're often looking at ways that we can more efficiently reduce pollution. And by more efficiently, I mean do it at lower cost, getting more bang for the buck. And that's where economic incentives play a big role. So watch for ways that we could perhaps change people's incentive structures to get them to change their behavior. So you can almost always imagine some way that we could throw money at someone to get them to do something we want them to do, right? Or fine them to get them to stop doing things that we don't want them to do. But I'm not talking about a big fine where if you're caught, you'll be busted. That's kind of back in the command and control world. I'm talking about something that is built into the price of what they do. So I mentioned for each pound of effluent, you have to pay $2. Or for each ton of carbon that comes out your smokestack, you'll have to pay $32. Those are examples of emission taxes where we're taxing something that we don't like. And economists tend to say, well, incentives really matter, right? Right now we tax labor. Labor is a good thing. We actually want people to be working. But we have a high income tax. We tax when people work. So a lot of environmental economists say, why don't we cut back our labor taxes a little bit? Cut back the income tax and instead tax the things we don't like carbon emissions. But we'll talk about that much more later in the semester. For now, the important thing is to know the idea of incentives. We have economic things that can help motivate people to do more of the stuff we like and less of the stuff we don't like. And think about ways that we could perhaps structure some kind of fee for doing something bad or some kind of reward for doing something good. That would be an economic incentive. And that's the way economists often like to think about changing behavior in a way that doesn't force people to do things and also ends up doing it much more efficiently, meaning it's at much lower cost in general. All right, that's it for today. I look forward to working with you going forward. We'll see you later.